Ever get that feeling? Like you're wrestling with a really big philosophical idea, and it's kind of like wading through mud, dense arguments, complicated jargon, all
Oh,
that.
yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Well, here on the deep dive, we aim to cut through all of that. Today, we're diving into the mind of a philosophical giant of the 20th century, Willard Van Orman Quine.
A deep dive indeed.
And to guide our exploration, we'll be primarily drawing from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Quine.
It's like having a seasoned trail guide, pointing out all the key landmarks on this really intricate intellectual landscape.
Exactly. We're here to unearth the most impactful insights from Quine's work, the ideas that basically reshaped philosophical discussions. We're talking about concepts that challenged those really ingrained distinctions and offered a whole new perspective on how we grasp knowledge and reality. So if you're someone who loves those aha moments, those moments where a complex puzzle suddenly clicks into place, then you're in for a treat with this deep dive.
Buckle up.
To set the stage a bit, Quine lived from 1908 to 2000, and most of his work was in theoretical philosophy and logic.
Right, he didn't really delve much into those practical areas like ethics or political philosophy.
Not really, no, but he's probably most famous for his powerful critiques of logical empiricism, particularly their strong emphasis on the separation between analytic and synthetic truths.
That's right. But as we'll see, this wasn't just some isolated attack. It was part of a much larger and surprisingly unified philosophical vision,
Yeah.
one that blurred the lines between philosophy and, good old-fashioned empirical science.
All right, let's jump right into the deep end here. One of the most fundamental aspects of Quine's thinking, his whole philosophical outlook, is his naturalism. And the Seppi entry really emphasizes that this commitment stayed remarkably consistent throughout his career.
It did, and it became more and more defined over time.
So how did Quine himself explain this naturalism?
Well, he famously said, and this was back in 1981, that naturalism is the recognition that it is within science itself and not in some prior philosophy, that reality is to be identified and described.
That's a powerful statement. He's saying reality is figured out within science, not in some separate philosophical realm.
Exactly.
But when Quine talks about science, he's not just talking about physics or chemistry.
No, not at all. The SEPI entry makes it clear that he used a very broad definition.
Broader than you might expect.
Oh yeah, much broader. He considered things like psychology, economics, sociology, even history as part of science. He laid this out pretty clearly in his 1995 work.
So basically, any systematic investigation of the world that's grounded in empirical evidence.
Exactly. For Quine, it's all science.
Which actually makes sense when you consider his view that scientific knowledge isn't some, separate and superior form of understanding. It's an extension of our everyday common sense.
It is. He famously said, "Science is not a substitute for common sense, but an extension of it." He even argued that scientists are basically doing the same thing as everyone else, relying on evidence just in a more, rigorous and organized way.
Okay, so if science is how we understand reality, then what makes us so confident in that? What justifies our trust in the methods of science as the most reliable path to knowledge?
Well, this is where Quine's naturalism gets really interesting. He argued that the justification for trusting science has to come from within science itself.
So there's no need for some outside philosophical foundation.
No, he completely rejected that idea.
So he's comfortable with a bit of circular reasoning there.
He embraces it. It's naturalism applied to itself.
So, in a way, he's turning the tables on the traditional view of philosophy. Instead of philosophy providing the groundwork for science, he's saying that philosophy is subject to the same standards of evidence and justification as any other scientific field.
He is. No special treatment for philosophy.
And that's a pretty big departure from how philosophy is often seen.
Absolutely. Philosophy is often thought of as the foundation for all other knowledge. But Quine put it on equal footing with everything else. He said it best in 1969, epistemology is contained in natural science as a chapter of psychology.
Wow. So in Quine's view, when philosophers are investigating knowledge, they should be looking at it from the perspective of a scientist.
Exactly.
And this all comes back to that idea of relying on evidence, right? Quine was adamant that we shouldn't try to justify science with some pre-existing philosophy, but we should always stick to strong scientific standards.
He was. And for him, those standards involved basing our claims on external observable evidence. That's what he argued for in 1974.
So that's the affirmative side of his naturalism, this strong embrace of science as our primary guide to understanding the world. But there's also a negative aspect, right, where he starts to critically examine a lot of the key terms and distinctions that philosophers have traditionally relied on.
Right. What's interesting is that he's not saying those terms are meaningless. He's just saying that they're not very helpful for achieving the kind of rigorous, objective account of the world that science aims for.
So it's not that they're wrong, they're just not the best tools for the job.
Exactly. And a great example of this is the concept of meaning.
Which is a huge concept in philosophy. It's central to so much of what philosophers talk about.
It is, and Quine was quite critical of it. He said that while studying language is valuable, relying on a vague or undefined notion of meaning can actually hold back scientific progress.
So it's like a false sense of understanding.
Yes, exactly.
Mhm.
He argued in 1981 that we need to be really careful about leaning too heavily on the idea of meaning.
And meaning wasn't the only target of his scrutiny. The SEP entry mentions a whole bunch of other philosophical staples that Quine questioned.
Right. Terms like thought, belief, experience, necessity. He questioned all of them. He argued that we shouldn't just accept those terms at face value. We need to carefully justify and explain them.
He even questioned knowledge itself.
Yes, he did. He argued in 1984 that the term knowledge is too vague and doesn't have clear boundaries.
So he's saying it's not a very precise tool for rigorous philosophical analysis.
Exactly.
But it's not like Quine was just tearing down traditional philosophy. He was also offering a constructive program, right?
Absolutely. He had his own set of philosophical questions, even though he saw them as being continuous with, rather than separate from, scientific inquiry.
And that brings us to his naturalized epistemology.
Right.
Now, what's interesting is that Quine wasn't a fan of all kinds of skepticism. He dismissed the kind of radical skepticism that doubts the very existence of the external world.
He did. He famously said, and this was in 1981, clearly in none of those cases could the world deviate from a perfectly predicted theory.
So that kind of all-encompassing skepticism just wasn't productive for him.
Not at all.
But there was a specific type of skepticism that he did engage with, right?
He did. He was concerned with the classic philosophical problem of the gap between our sensory experiences and our knowledge of the world. Like, how do we get from those limited sensory inputs to a rich understanding of the world around us? He even drew on Gestalt psychology to argue that we directly perceive things like three-dimensional space.
So our perception of space isn't just something we infer from more basic sensory data, it's something we grasp directly.
That's what he argued.
But then, didn't he himself raise a skeptical challenge to this? Something about a challenge to natural science from within natural science?
He did. He pointed out that science tells us that all our information about the world comes through impacts on our sensory receptors. That was something he emphasized in his 1990 work. So the skeptical question becomes, if all we have are these sensory inputs, how can we possibly know about this vast external world?
How can we know that our scientific theories are true if all we have to go on are these limited traces?
Right. It's a tricky problem. And Quine's solution wasn't to retreat to some philosophical first principle. Instead, he doubled down on his naturalism. He said we need a naturalistic account of how our knowledge and the language we use to express it develops.
So we need to explain how we go from those basic sensory inputs to complex knowledge using the tools of science.
Exactly. And he saw this naturalized epistemology as a continuation of the original epistemological problem, but now is being investigated from a scientific perspective.
Okay, so we've seen how Quine's naturalism applies to epistemology, to how we know things. But it also extends to metaphysics, to what exists, right?
Yes, absolutely. For Quine, metaphysics isn't about engaging in some kind of a priori speculation about the nature of reality. Instead, it's about figuring out what our best scientific theories tell us about what exists.
So metaphysics is basically just a description of the ontological commitments of our best science.
In a way, yes. And this is where the idea of regimented theory comes in.
Regimented theory. That sounds like a very specific Quinian concept.
It is. Basically, it's the idea that we can take all of our scientific knowledge and reformulate it in the clearest, simplest, and most logically precise way possible. It's about pushing that scientific drive for clarity and precision to its ultimate limit.
So it's like a thought experiment. Like, what would our ideal theory of reality look like?
Exactly. And Quine had some pretty specific ideas about what that would look like. He argued that the framework for this regimented theory would be first-order logic with identity, with variables ranging over physical objects and sets, and using physicalistic predicates.
Okay, hold on a second. Let's break that down a bit. What's first-order logic?
It's a formal system, a kind of logical language, that lets us make precise statements about objects and their properties. It's very basic, but also incredibly powerful. And the idea that the variables should only range over physical objects and sets, for Quine, is basically a statement about what ultimately exists.
So it's like he's saying, look, this is the fundamental stuff of reality, physical things and sets.
Right. And he believed that all traits of reality worthy of the name can be set down in an idiom of this austere form, if in any idiom. That's how he put it in 1960.
So he was really ambitious in this project. He was trying to articulate the basic structure of reality itself.
He was.
Okay, now let's go back to one of Quine's most famous arguments. His critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction. This was a key point of disagreement with the logical empiricists like Rudolf Carnap. Remind us again, what exactly is this distinction?
Sure. The logical empiricists believed there was a sharp difference between two kinds of truths. Analytic truths, which are true just because of the meanings of the words or the rules of language, like all bachelors are unmarried men. That's true by
Yeah,
definition.
no, I get that. And the other kind.
The other kind is synthetic truths. Those are truths about the world, matters of fact, that we learn through experience, like the cat is on the mat. You can't just figure that out by thinking about the words. You have to actually look and see.
Right. So analytic truths are true by definition, and synthetic truths are true because of how the world is.
Exactly. And the logical empiricist famously thought that logic and mathematics were analytic.
And Quine came along and basically blew up this whole distinction.
He did. And his critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction is one of his most influential contributions to philosophy. It really shook things up.
And this wasn't just some minor disagreement, right? It really went to the heart of the logical empiricist project.
Absolutely. It forced them to rethink some of their most basic assumptions about meaning and knowledge.
And how does Carnap's principle of tolerance fit into all of this?
Well, Carnap's principle of tolerance, which he put forward after 1932, said there isn't one correct language for science or philosophy. He thought that philosophy could analyze different linguistic frameworks, each with its own set of rules. But this principle relied heavily on the idea that we could clearly distinguish between analytic and synthetic statements.
So if we can't draw a clear line between those two types of statements, then Carnap's whole idea of choosing between different linguistic frameworks becomes problematic.
Exactly. And Quine argued that even if we could distinguish between analytic and synthetic sentences, we might still have good reasons to reject a supposedly analytic sentence.
And those reasons could be similar to the reasons we reject a synthetic sentence.
Right. Like if it leads to a less coherent or less effective overall theory. He used the example of force equals mass times acceleration to illustrate this.
So even a statement that seems to be true by definition could be revised or rejected if it doesn't fit with our broader understanding of the world.
Exactly. And this all connects to Quine's holism.
Which is the idea that our beliefs are all interconnected, right?
Yes. He argued that most sentences don't have isolated implications for our experience. It's usually larger chunks of our theory that connect with the world. And the justification for accepting any sentence, whether it's seemingly analytic or synthetic, depends on how it contributes to the overall coherence and explanatory power of our whole web of belief.
So it's not about individual sentences being true or false in isolation. It's about how they fit into our overall understanding of the world.
Right. And this really blurred the line between those changes within a language and changes to the language itself, which is what Carnap had tried to distinguish with his idea of internal and external revisions.
So if Quine rejected the analytic-synthetic distinction, how did he explain the apparent necessity and a priori nature of logic and mathematics?
Well, he said that logic and math seem necessary and a priori, not because they're true by definition in some isolated sense, but because they're so central to our entire web of belief.
So they're deeply embedded in our understanding of the world.
Exactly. And because they're connected to so many different experiences, they appear to be independent of any specific observation.
Okay, but didn't Quine later suggest a more limited definition of analyticity? Something about learning the truth of a sentence just by understanding the meanings of the words?
He did, but he didn't see this as a major shift in his position. He still maintained that there wasn't a fundamental epistemological difference between those supposedly analytic truths and the synthetic ones. They're all part of the same interconnected web of belief.
So the real disagreement with Carnap wasn't about the definition of analyticity itself. It was about this deeper idea of whether there's a fundamental difference between how we justify different kinds of knowledge.
Right. Quine believed that all our cognitive efforts, whether we're revising basic logical principles or tweaking our beliefs about the world, are ultimately aimed at the same goal: a better, more coherent understanding of reality.
And they're all subject to the same basic kind of justification.
Exactly. And that's a core part of his naturalism and his view that philosophy is continuous with science.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground with Quine's naturalism and his critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction. Now let's move on to two other really interesting ideas that came out of his work: the indeterminacy of translation and the underdetermination of theory.
Two very closely related but distinct ideas.
Right, so let's start with underdetermination. What is that all about?
Well, it's the idea that you could have multiple different scientific theories that are all perfectly compatible with the available evidence. Imagine two competing theories about, say, the formation of the universe. Both explain all the data we have, but they propose different mechanisms.
So we can't tell which theory is correct just by looking at the evidence.
Right. And Quine acknowledged that this was a complex issue. But importantly, he didn't think it was a threat to scientific realism. For him, the best scientific theory is our best current understanding of reality, even if there might be other equally good alternatives out there.
The STEP entry gives a pretty straightforward example of this involving changes in spelling. Can you explain why that kind of underdetermination isn't really that interesting philosophically?
Sure, if you just change the spelling of a word consistently throughout a theory, you technically have a different set of sentences. But you haven't actually changed anything about the theory's content or predictions. It's just a superficial change.
So the more interesting kind of underdetermination is when you have theories that can't be translated into each other even by changing the meanings of the terms.
Exactly. Like, imagine two theories that use completely different concepts to explain the same phenomena.
And Quine wasn't sure how to resolve this issue.
No, he explored different approaches, which he labeled sectarian and ecumenical. But ultimately, his naturalism led him to believe that even if this kind of radical underdetermination is real, it doesn't mean our current scientific theories are wrong or that we can't have knowledge about the world.
Okay, now let's talk about the indeterminacy of translation. This sounds like it could have some pretty big implications for our ability to understand each other.
It could. The basic idea is that there might be multiple ways to translate a language that are all compatible with the evidence about how speakers use that language. But these translations wouldn't just be different ways of saying the same thing, they would actually convey different meanings.
So it's not just about finding different words that have the same meaning.
No, it's much deeper than that. For Quine, the criterion for successful communication is fluent interaction, being able to predict how a speaker will behave verbally and non-verbally. And from that perspective, the idea of fixed objective meanings is kind of suspect.
So the indeterminacy of translation doesn't mean we can't translate languages or understand each other. It just means there might be more than one right way to do it.
Exactly. And none of those ways capture some absolute objective meaning.
Now, the SEPI entry distinguishes between indeterminacy of reference and holophrastic indeterminacy. What's the difference?
Indeterminacy of reference, which is also known as ontological relativity, is the idea that even when we can translate a whole sentence correctly, the individual terms in that sentence might refer to different things in different translations.
So even if two translations say the same thing overall, the words they use might be picking out different parts of reality.
Exactly. A classic example is the word gavagai. If someone points at a rabbit and says gavagai, we could translate that as rabbit, but we could also translate it as undetached rabbit part, or temporal stage of a rabbit, or even the spatial region occupied by a rabbit.
As long as we adjust the translations of other related terms accordingly.
Right. And Quine's point is that all the objects we talk about are, in a sense, theoretical constructs. So there's always some room for this kind of reinterpretation.
And what about holophrastic indeterminacy?
That's the idea that entire sentences could have multiple correct translations, and these translations would convey different propositions about the world. It's a more radical claim than indeterminacy of reference.
So it's not just about the individual words referring to different things, it's about the sentences themselves having different meanings.
Exactly. And Quine saw this as a more speculative idea, something that we don't have definitive proof for. It's connected to the idea of the underdetermination of theory, suggesting that if there are multiple theories that fit the evidence, we might be able to translate someone's utterances in ways that align with different theories.
So even though these ideas of indeterminacy and underdetermination are pretty mind-blowing, they weren't actually essential to Quine's main argument.
Right. They're interesting consequences of his philosophy, but they weren't the central pillars. His main critiques of traditional philosophy, like his rejection of the analytic-synthetic distinction, stood on their own.
Okay, well, that's quite a tour of Quine's thought. We've explored his naturalism, his critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction, his naturalized epistemology and metaphysics, and even these fascinating ideas of underdetermination and indeterminacy. It's clear that Quine had a huge impact on 20th century philosophy.
He did. He really shook things up and forced philosophers to rethink some of their most basic assumptions.
And for you, our listener, who's interested in getting a clear and concise understanding of a major philosophical figure, Quine offers a really radical and powerful way of thinking about knowledge, reality, and the very nature of philosophical inquiry.
Absolutely. He challenges a lot of traditional ways of thinking and invites us to see philosophy as part of this broader scientific project of understanding the world.
And that brings us to our final thought for you to ponder. If we take Quine's view seriously and we see philosophy as operating within the domain of science, how might that change our understanding of philosophical fields that seem pretty far removed from the natural sciences, like philosophy of language or even metaphysics itself?
Hmm. That's a great question to consider. And if you're intrigued by these ideas, we definitely recommend checking out some of Quine's own work, like his essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, is a classic, and his book, Word and Object, is a really comprehensive presentation of his philosophy.
There's also a ton of great secondary literature out there if you want to explore these ideas further.
There is.
All right, well, that wraps up our deep dive into the work of Willard Van Orman Quine.
Thanks for listening.
Be sure to join us next time as we delve into another fascinating topic in our ongoing quest for knowledge and understanding.